Let us pray. Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. There is a heresy called supersessionism. Now, a heresy is a false teaching, according to the church. And supersessionism is the false teaching that Christianity replaces Judaism. Supersessionism is the false teaching that the New Testament somehow pushes the Old Testament out of the way, replaces it completely. Supersessionism is the false teaching that the new covenant that we have renders the old covenant abolished or expired. The heresy of supersessionism is that somehow we as Christians have taken over God's love and God's grace and God's promise, and what God was up to in Moses and the prophets somehow just doesn't matter anymore. That's the heresy of supersessionism. Now, we know that it's a heresy because in this passage we read today, just before the passage that we read, Jesus is setting up parts of this long sermon that he's given, and he says, just so you're not confused, because I'm about to do some criticizing of the way that we live out the law. Just so you're not confused, I haven't come to abolish the law. Rather, I have come to fulfill the law. We know that supersessionism is a heresy because Jesus says, oh no, nothing's expiring in all what God was up to in the Old Testament. Christianity is not taking everything and hogging God to itself. Well, the reason why this heresy of supersessionism keeps popping up again and again, generation after generation, is because people misinterpret the passage that we just read, where Jesus is criticizing how it is that people of his day, and the criticism reaches into our present, how it is that we continually today, how it is that people are finding loopholes in God's law. When people are finding ways to skirt around what it is that God expects of us. The people are finding ways to sin one day, go to the altar, make a sacrifice, receive God's forgiveness, and then go out and sin the next day and start the process all over. Jesus is annoyed, and there's Jesus with a face plant. Jesus is annoyed that people are walking around splitting hairs to find a way just to do the crime, do a little bit of the time, but not really have any change of heart. Jesus is annoyed that people are walking around with their hardened hearts and they're making a mess everywhere, and they think that the solution to that is just take some time and mop it up, clean it up, but not do any cleaning up where it matters. No transformation of the heart. Now, you probably remember when you were a kid, or maybe you're dealing with kids, that when they do something wrong, they're still learning. You can't just come down hard like a hammer onto a child expecting that, they need to be punished in order to learn their lessons. So it is with God's law. And Jesus hasn't lost sight of this. Jesus understands that it's an okay thing in his day, and we can push that forward into the present, to know that when we make a mistake, when we drop that rock and we make a splash and it gets people wet, when we make a mistake, that, you have to take into consideration, what were your intentions? How is it that we help people to learn? It's not about, here's your punishment. And we know how it is when we're adults, when people have hurt us, how important it is to make sure that we give some grace. We recognize that you can't really hold it against people. The pathway to change isn't just meting out harsh punishment. But Jesus is annoyed when we as adults start acting like those children who are pointing to someone else. Here's my excuse for what I've done. Forgive me. Clean up my mess. But we don't do any work to soften our hearts, to transform our hearts, to make sure whatever that habit is we have of making a mess, that gets changed. Jesus says to the disciples, where it says in the law that you're not supposed to murder people, it's a bad thing, and that if you murder, you're going to be punished. In that moment, Jesus says, let's go a little deeper than that. I say to you, if you're angry, that's inappropriate. If you're angry, and then he starts getting all, overstating things, hyperbolic, and saying, if you're angry with people, then you're going to be thrown in jail. Then you're going to suffer. Jesus' way of making fun of all these punishments that we mete out, instead of focusing on where change needs to happen. What's wrong with murder? It's wrong because it comes from a particular hardened heart. A hardened heart that gets angry. Jesus is saying we can do all the work in the world, always cleaning up every murderous mess. But if we don't change our hearts, if we don't help people to figure out how to get past anger, how to get past hostility to one another, if we don't deal with that, we're going to be cleaning up messes for now until eternity. Jesus is saying, don't just focus on the splash of a mess that you make. Figure out how you're driving dangerously and how you're causing that splash, and make your change there. Now, in the news this week, and for the past few weeks, has been this standoff between really Canada and the Wet'suwet'en Nation in northern BC. And of course, we could probably get into a big argument here Sunday morning about what's wrong and how we would address it. But here's the dilemma, put very simply, that you have a nation of Canada negotiating with some democratically elected band chiefs put in place by the Indian Act of Canada to get agreement to build a pipeline. And you have disagreement by the hereditary chiefs, those who are established by tradition, in the lands larger than just the reserve, overseen by the Band Council, a territory that is unceded territory and remains the nation of a pre-colonialized people. And what I bring this up because I want to make a point. We can, until the cows come home, try and figure out how it is that we're going to tweak our laws, apply our laws, negotiate within particular legal frameworks. We can do that until the cows come home. And that's not going to lead to reconciliation between peoples. To only focus on the law and its loopholes, but not expect that we have to soften our hearts, to be transformed at the level of heart, is no different than continually walking around with a big heavy rock, splashing people everywhere, and thinking that we can then clean it up afterwards. Jesus is saying, you got to get to the heart of the matter. If you're going to make change in this world, in this kingdom that I have ushered into human history, it works at a completely different level than all of your rules, all of your legal systems, because it requires something of each of us to be transformed at the level of our heart. We are a people called to have our hearts transformed. Jesus says this is so important that I don't want you to get away with this idea that when you hurt others, when you injure others, that the solution is simply come to the altar, make your sacrifice, receive your forgiveness, and then go out and hurt again. Jesus teaches his disciples, you know what? If you're coming to the table, and let me translate that here. If you're coming to worship on Sunday morning, and you know that someone has something they're upset about with you, and this is an important point, not you know that someone has hurt you. It's no, you realize that someone is accusing you. You know what you need to do? Before you go any further in worship, you need to stop. You need to get up. You need to go. You need to go reconcile with that person. And then when you've reconciled, come on back and finish this worship ritual. Now, here's the thing I don't want you to miss. That's asking way too much. Jesus is saying to his disciples, if you go to the temple and you're in the middle of a sacrifice, a ritual sacrifice, and you realize that you're not in complete harmony with someone else, drop everything, push pause on your ritual, and go back and get reconciled. Jesus is telling this to people who live in Galilee, which is a few days' journey to where you would be going in the temple. Jesus is saying, it's impossible, no matter how hard you try, to sacrifice properly. So you know what? Let's get to the heart of the matter. Change your heart. Change your heart so we're not all running around, always trying to clean up the messes that we make. Change your heart. Focus on reconciliation if you're angry. Maybe some of you heard this week on CBC Radio, there was a story sort of originating out of BC about a man named Eddie Charles, a survivor of residential school system. And Eddie Charlie, his name, was telling his story, broadcasting it not that long ago. And there was a grade 5 elementary school teacher in London at Riverside Elementary School who heard this and decided, I'm going to have my grade 5 students write letters to Eddie Charlie. I'm going to have them hear his expression of his pain from his time in residential schools. And I let my children learn that there's more to solving this when it comes to living out the call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is way above the heads of most grade 5 students, but instead we're going to work on their hearts. Have them listen to this man's story and write some letters. And that's what they did. They wrote letters, and these young children, these grade 5 children, were writing from their heart, saying things like, "Dear Eddie, my heart broke when I heard about what happened to you as a child. Dear Eddie, I'm so sorry about what you went through. Dear Eddie, I know what it's like to be bullied and have people not treat me well because I'm different. Dear Eddie, when I heard your story, I cried." And these letters went to Eddie Charlie, and he read them. And this is a picture of Eddie Charlie with his friend, I think her name's Tracy Spray. And his heart was moved. And you can just imagine that is where healing takes place. That reconciliation between people is not going to be mapped out at some ink on a page legal level, but it's going to be mapped out on hearts coming together and people understanding one another. Eddie Charlie said, in this picture, he's breaking down emotionally, recounting this experience for him, that compassion is what reconciliation should look like. Jesus is saying, your heart, that source of passion for you, it needs to change. And it needs to meet people beyond hostility, but in love. We are a people, as followers of Jesus Christ, who can have our hearts transformed, that in God's love, that hardness of our hearts can be broken away so that we can be softened, so that we can love others the way that God loves us. Amen.